Hello. Today we're continuing our conversation of corporal punishments. I want to remind you what the elements of the response paper include. We're asking for five sections: history, physical features, use, route to punishment, and philosophical approach. Last time in class, we addressed the history and the use of corporal punishment. I also want to remind you that this response paper calls for you to address one form of corporal punishment, not 5 or 6 different forms. Choose one form to talk about in your response paper. Okay, so we have covered history and use, and we left it last time with philosophical approach, and I want to start there. As you'll recall, I asked, what philosophical principle do you believe is involved in the case of the spectacle of corporal punishments? So let me remind you what we mean by the spectacle of corporal punishment in the late medieval or early modern era. We mean the fact that it was these events gathered large crowds, that there was an audience for them, that there were particular ceremonies associated with it, as in this case, the armed escort bringing the accused in the wagon, where you see them being ministered to by a clergy person. This is another slide showing Tyburn gallows just outside London. Get a sense of the large crowd that gathered, and again you see the personnel, the army there, signifying that the event, the execution, has the support and is under the authority of the ruler. This is a reenactment, obviously. You get a sense of how dense the crowds might have been. I think this is a pretty accurate reenactment. You can see the little children to the far left of the picture clambering up on the walls to see the accused go by during the procession, which took them from the court to the place of execution. And here's a plan of Tyburn Tree, the execution spot that was just outside London. And I want you to notice anything that might be peculiar about it. It was there permanently. And as you notice, it's in the middle of the intersection of these two roads. So obviously meant to, obviously meant to be unavoidable. Travelers going through this area could not help but have to go around the gallows, whether they're in use or not, and therefore be reminded of the gallows. So does all of that, the sense of an audience, the communicative nature of the spectacle of execution or other forms of punishment in this era, the audience, the expressive nature of the event, all of that give you any ideas about what philosophical approach? We haven't talked about it. I just thought some of you might have encountered it from other classes, and here we go. Individual deterrence and general deterrence. These are two different kinds of deterrence. On your response papers, it will not be sufficient to simply write the word deterrence. You have to specify individual deterrence or general deterrence or both. So what's the difference between individual deterrence and general deterrence? This is a good way of thinking about the difference. Let's just imagine that the person standing up in front of everybody is about to be executed, and the people sitting down in front of her are the audience members, there to witness the execution. So the person who's about to be executed, or let's say not executed, let's say flogged in this case. He's going to be flogged, going to be branded. That person is subject to the effects of individual deterrence. The act is intended to have the effect of deterring her from committing the same offense or a different offense in the future. It works on the individual to deter the individual from committing wrongdoing in the future. That's right, collective or general deterrence works on the audience. By witnessing the flogging or the branding, they are, it is hoped, deterred from committing the act for which the person is being punished. So to repeat, there are two forms of deterrence, and they are different. Individual deterrence acts on the individual and deters the person, typically the person being punished, from committing the same act again. Collective deterrence serves on the audience of the event. So obviously you have one given event or one given display of punishment, and it is working simultaneously in two different ways. Okay, so the question is, can the death penalty ever serve as a form of individual deterrence? Let me repeat that. Can the death penalty, execution, the taking of a life, ever serve as a form of individual deterrence? Think about it. Individual deterrence is a philosophy by which individuals who receive the sanction or the punishment are supposedly deterred from ever committing that act again. So, by definition, the death penalty cannot serve as a deterrence. Because deterrence, it's true that the person will never commit the act again because they will be dead. But they will not be deterred from committing the act. They will be incapacitated from committing the act. And incapacitation, which we'll talk about later, and deterrence are two very different things. Incapacitation refers to creating the physical conditions which make it impossible or unlikely that a person will commit future acts of wrongdoing, whereas deterrence operates on an emotional or internal level and makes the person subject to his or her own urges of deterring themselves. So when thinking about this, if you choose for your response paper a form of punishment that is likely to end in death, it would be correct to specify that the audience feels collective or general deterrence, but it would not be correct to say in that instance that the individual is subject to individual deterrence. People who are dead cannot be deterred. Okay, so now we have covered philosophical punishment. We're going to talk about the route to punishment. What I said in class, I want to emphasize just briefly here, is that this was not an extrajudicial form of punishment. In fact, this was what you might think of as the normal criminal justice system. And back in the day, it looked very similar in many regards to what we would think of as criminal justice system in the United States in the 21st century. There were no police, but a person might be apprehended by the sheriff or other authority. There would be a trial in which the person would defend herself or himself. In these slides, you can see the practice was for the accused, as in the slide in the top left, to stand in the dock, to stand there for the duration of the trial, to face witnesses against them, and to speak in his or her own behalf. The judges, you can see them on the top left, are listening to the proceedings, and there's a jury. So very familiar. This is a very clear-cut judicial process by which there are all sorts of protections, like the jury, like the right to present evidence in your own behalf. We can argue about whether or not they were effective protections, but this was nothing like being thrown in a dungeon by a prince that doesn't like your family. After a person was convicted of a particular crime, that person would be sent to jail. And this is where a lot of students get confused. A jail is not the same thing as a prison. It wasn't the same thing in London or in England in the early modern era, and it's not the same thing today. A jail and a prison are two different things. A jail is where people are held when they're involved in court proceedings, in trial, and their case is being waited to be adjudicated. And a jail is where people go pending the execution of sentence. So after a trial, a person would be sent to a jail where they would be held, awaiting the branding or the flogging. It's a holding facility, and it retains the same function today, except today, if you're sentenced to a year or less, a year or shorter, at least in Illinois, you might serve your entire sentence in the jail. A sentence of a year or longer, you'll be sent to the prison. So the jail is simply a holding facility. The alternative would be sentencing somebody to being branded, or sentencing somebody to being executed, or sentencing somebody to flogging, and then telling them, just go home, and we'll come and get you in another week to deliver the punishment. Well, of course, if you tell somebody to go home, and that you'll come back and kill them in a week's time, they're probably not going to be there when you show up to collect them. So the jail is a holding facility for people who are either in the midst of criminal proceedings or awaiting the execution of punishment. And obviously, this drawing to the left is a little funky because this person is not being held particularly well by the chains on his feet, but you get the major point. Jails looked very similar to what you might expect. They were often brick or stone with bars on the window. They held a person fast, and the jailer or warden was responsible for keeping them there, but these were not places where folks stayed long term. Maybe you would be there a week before, if you were executed to death penalty. You were taken from the jail. The main jail in London is indicated here, right, to the red dot to the right. I hope you see that. To Tyburn, which is the place of execution. I just want to remind you, so that's quite a long distance for a procession, and I want to remind you that as the procession proceeded to Tyburn, crowds would gather. But of course, when I talk about the route to punishment, I'm not talking about the route to Tyburn. I'm talking about the judicial route through which people were processed as part of the criminal justice system. So now we have covered route to punishment. And the last thing we need to talk about is the physical features. So I'm going to briefly go over the different types of corporal punishment. There's flogging, which is showing a few different images of flogging here. Flogging refers to whipping, and typically whipping required only the very minimum of physical infrastructure. You could manage it with, as in this case, a tall wooden element to which a person was fastened, in this case with metal cuffs. Here's a picture of whipping in Australia, and again, you've just got a couple of wooden elements that a person was fastened to, and then, of course, you need a whip. So whipping is very low tech. What I want you to notice, though, is that it still has a spectacle of element, even though we're talking about Australia here in the 19th century. You still have the crowd, you still have the people in charge on the right who are overseeing the whipping. It still has the element of spectacle, but it's a very low cost, low tech means of implementing spectacle. You don't need, it doesn't cost much to whip somebody. Branding is another form of punishment that is covered in the reading, and I want you to note the way that Sperenberg divides these forms of punishment up in the reading. Branding was often done actually right in the court itself. Irons were kept for the purpose of branding a person with the appropriate letter or symbol that would serve to deter them and onlookers from future forms of wrongdoing, not only and this was achieved not only at the time of the administration of the punishment, but also during those years when punishment was administered on a visible form of the body. For permanently, people would see the brand and supposedly be deterred from, from committing an act of wrongdoing. Now we move on to pillory and stocks. Again, you see this elements of spectacle here. It is kind of over the top. All sorts of things are happening in the audience. This is actually the pillorying of a famous author. But the point remains that the person was elevated, typically put in a square, a town square. People were encouraged to come by. Sometimes a sign would be hung around their neck. They might be out there for Gosh, it varies so much. Somebody could be sentenced to 2 hours in the stock, or they could be sentenced to 2 hours in the stock every other day for a week, or 3 periods in the stock. In fact, that's what this person was sentenced to. 3 periods in the stock over a period of 2 days. Over a period of 2 weeks. He had to be in the stock, then go back. In this case, he was actually allowed to go back to his home because he was famous and people knew where to find him, and they knew he wasn't going to run away. So there was no set time. It was up to the judge to determine how long a person would spend here. Here's an example from an American colonial setting of a much less elaborate stock. And I'm showing you this to give you a sense of how it worked. A person's legs, in this case, would be held fast. And I can never remember the difference between a pillory and a stock. The person's legs would be held fast. They would not be able to move. So she's smiling in this picture because, of course, her buddy is taking the picture. But I want to disagree with the point that Sperenberg makes in the argument and leave this up to you for your own determination. He says that being held in the pillory or the stock did not amount to a form of physical abuse or physical punishment. But I would invite you to hold your legs out in this position for 2 hours while your neighbors come by and pelt you with vegetables and rocks and see if you've experienced it as a form of physical punishment. I think it's betrays a real lack of imagination and sympathy on Sperenberg's part to assert that this is not a form of physical punishment. You're also out in the elements, so it could be raining, it could be snowing, it could be sunny. Very, very sunny, painfully sunny. And you're going to get sore. It's going to be painful. This is very much a sign of an act of physical punishment. Now, your neighbors weren't supposed to come by and kill you while you were in the stock. That would amount to murder, actually. But they were encouraged to display their displeasure. That's the whole point. In this case, the 2 women are showing kindness and mercy to somebody in the stock during the medieval era. But what I'm showing you is how exposed a person was, how helpless a person was. Here's another example of somebody being held in the stock. This is another example of a low-tech option for the stock. He is placed on a wooden seat, and the stock is placed around his neck. But again, don't mistake a scene like this for a scene of leisure. If you've got a heavy wooden board fastened around your neck and you can't move one way or the other comfortably, and you're stuck there, and people, that part of the punishment is staying seated on this seat, this could be excruciating. And finally, 2 more pictures to show you stocks and pillories. Maybe 3 more. And I include this picture to show you how it was the case sometimes that people were physically attacked when they were held in the stock. There's a story behind this, but I won't tell it to you now. I just want you to note the element of physical punishment that was accompanied going in a stock and being held open to the opprobrium of your neighbors and friends. Stocks didn't change much over the years. And again, this is a nice job of showing the spectacle aspect of being in the stock. Up on a stage, representatives of the king to the right here, audience in the down below, witnessing the punishment and the act of spectacle. And here another example of the stock. So some variety, but as you can see, typically made out of wood, fastens a person's head, arms, legs, or some combination of all of those. And expose the person to the elements and to the neighbors, to the community. And that was a part of the punishment. I'm going to talk about garroting. Garroting is a form of punishment that you probably haven't heard of before. It is still practiced in some parts of the world, but it was never really practiced in the American colonies or the United States, so you may not have heard of it. Garroting it consists of is a form of the death penalty. So a person who is garroted is killed. And there are many different designs of garroting chairs. You can see one here. The person would sit on the stool. This is the stand on which the whole device was held, and her neck would be placed within the bond. The executioner would tighten the neck brace, and the person would be strangled to death. Here's another version of the garrote. In some cases, the tightening element was attached to a sharpened screw that went into the back of a person's neck to kill them in that fashion too. So in at least two different ways, the executioner was assured of killing the victim. As the reading states, garroting was often used for women. It was considered a more dignified form of death than hanging, because when a woman was hung, her body, as they thought of it, their private parts were exposed. They didn't think that was nice. So by being garroted, by putting a woman to death through garroting method, her dignity was preserved, although she was being strangled to death. So here you see it being practiced, and I want to note the elements that we've spoken about before: the presence of religious authorities, bestowing their authority to the act, thereby indicating that the ruler who has administered the act, the punishment, has the authority and approval of the religious authorities and the divine authority. And here's a pretty famous example of garroting in Barcelona in 1894 as part of a rebellion. So obviously this is way past the time period that we're looking at. I'm showing you this image because I want to let you see how garroting lent itself well to displays of public spectacle. In this case, the garroting stools were placed on a stage in the courtyard, which is right outside the prison. Crowds gathered. There were armed soldiers and members of the armed forces there, signifying the official element, the official aspect of this event. Religious authorities are there in the front with their pointed hoods, signifying the approval of the religious authorities. This is very much a spectacle. And I want to go to this picture, which is a painting of the same courtyard when there was no garroting taking place. So this is what it might look like when it's in use for the spectacle of execution. And this is what it looked like when it was not. So all that was needed is a plain space, a large space, which could accommodate many, many people. This is another picture of, I think it's the very same event in Spain in the late 19th century. The anarchists, the people who were accused of anarchy, were executed through the garroting method, as you can see, one by one on the stage in the courtyard of the prison. Now we're moving on to beheading. Beheading were considered another way of genteelly executing women, for example, and noble people. Hanging was considered crude and beneath the dignity of such people. And beheading, like so many other forms of execution and punishment that we've looked at so far, required little in the form of infrastructure, physical infrastructure. What you need is an area in which to execute the individual and a sword. And that's what you see in this picture. The audience or the crowd are behind the fence watching. Two executioners in this case, are required to hold the head still. You can see that this was some sort of a mob event because there's a line to the right against the fence of people awaiting execution, and bodies here of people who have been executed. The authorities would have been on horseback, and the ordinary people on foot, and you can see I always interpret this to be members of the maybe she's in chains. Maybe she's being led to execution, but I've always interpreted some of the faces here to be faces of people who are in despair over the events taking place in the arena. And yes, these are the heads. Let's look at another example of beheading. Again, you have the same elements: a stage, a sword, a person being executed, very little that you need in addition to that, and the audience. You need an audience. You need for a spectacle to be witnessed by folks who can then imbibe the authority of the ruler and his might and power and sovereignty. You've got the ordinary people again here on foot. You've got the fancy people, the people in charge like the soldiers on horseback, both indicating the role of the sovereign and keeping crowd control. Now we're going to look at hanging, which was the main source, the main form of execution in England during this time. Tyburn Square is the site of execution outside London that we looked at earlier. It's easily recognizable because of this very distinctive shape of the gallows. So you can often see it in old movies or movies that show medieval or early modern or even Victorian era London. You can now be able to call out this Tyburn gallows, or sometimes they called it the Tyburn tree, because they were trying to be funny. Okay, the interesting thing about Tyburn tree, as you can see in this picture, is that an executioner could hang multiple people at one time, which made it even more of a spectacle for the audience. We've looked at this picture before. It shows a person coming in for the execution, being brought in for the execution, being ministered to by a clergy, being followed by soldiers, being followed as well by members of the crowd. The painter, Hogarth, who made this painting, was very critical of what executions had turned into. He said there were excuses for drunkenness and bad behavior, and was trying to illustrate that in this drawing. Here are the gallows. And here, the gallows were up there permanently, as was suggested by the plan I showed you earlier. And people came out to hang people at Tyburn. Well, actually, that's I think they did stop around the 18th century when it got too unruly. You'll want to check Spearenburg for that date, because the crowds got so out of control. And here's a picture that again demonstrates the route to Tyburn from Newgate Jail, which was right next to the courthouse, to Tyburn. Just scenes of drunkenness and, as people considered at the time, bad behavior on the parts of crowds, sometimes trying to jump into the wagon and free the person who was being conveyed to Tyburn, people getting killed in the rush. There was one case at Tyburn where Tyburn, the audiences were up to 10,000 people that collected. And let me show you. You can see the seating arenas that were erected, and these were erected just as needed, so they weren't very solid. And there's a famous instance when the seating collapsed because people were just being so active and jumping up and down, and they weren't very secure. The seating collapsed, and dozens of people were killed at the execution. So this was one of the things that discouraged authorities from continuing to hold executions at Tyburn, and in the future, following that point, hanging was done right outside Newgate Prison. Okay, it's called Newgate Prison in London, but I don't want you to mistake it for being a prison. It is not a prison. Newgate Prison is a jail. I know you're going to have questions about this, so I can just tell you definitively, Newgate Prison is not a prison. The prison has not been invented. There is no such thing as sentencing somebody to a term of incarceration. People are sentenced in the criminal justice system in England at this time, and in Europe at this time, 2 forms of corporal punishment, as distinct from being sentenced to stay in a monastery room in the religious system, or just being thrown in a dungeon through the extrajudicial system. I think that's it. If you have any questions, please get in touch with the TAs. Again, the response paper calls for you to speak about one of these forms of punishment. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday.